President.
Senator from Kansas.
I'd ask unanimous consent that I be able to address the Senate as if in morning business for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, thank you. I recently had a great conversation with an individual, August Busch III. He's the longtime president, CEO of Anheuser-Busch Company. And we talked about the state of the economy. We talked about the desire to get jobs created and the country back on a good, solid fiscal footing. That conversation reminded me of the opportunities we have here in the United States Senate, the United States Congress, to work together to see that we enact policies here in the nation's capital that would make a real difference in the everyday lives of Americans by creating jobs, by making certain that our business climate is beneficial to large and small businesses. And in that climate, they then have the opportunity to add additional employment opportunities for all Americans. In this overly partisan climate of Washington, D.C., it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we should all be working toward that same goal of getting our economy back on track. And I think the number one issue standing in the way of a robust economic growth is the uncertainty that continues to be there, as described in part by my colleague from Missouri in regard to the Affordable Care Act, but great uncertainty that is out there with Americans and people making family as well as business and investment decisions about where we're headed with our national debt and our deficit spending. As elected officials, Americans expect us to confront our nation's fiscal challenges and not to push them off into the future. But last year's budget shortfall, just to remind us of the facts, last year's budget shortfall reached $1.1 trillion, the fourth straight year of trillion-dollar deficits. This out-of-control, too much spending that we have in our government has increased our national debt to a record $16 trillion, which is more than the entire U.S. economy. It's more than the entire U.S. from both political parties. It's not always the opportunity that we sometimes take to point fingers, but it is over a long period of time we've allowed ourselves to live way beyond our means, and it's gone on far too long. When I was elected to the United States Senate just about 3 years ago, and I was invited to the White House to have a conversation with my colleagues and President Obama, the conversation was really all about deficit spending, the national debt, and the upcoming vote to raise the debt ceiling. Unfortunately, since that time, it's pretty much been business as usual here in Washington, D.C., and almost no progress has been made. It's time for us to get back beyond the conversations and the rhetoric that too often is pretty empty around here, and get down to the business of making real changes in the way that we conduct our business. First and foremost, we must reduce the government drag on the private sector. Startups and small businesses, the real job creators in this country, are being held down under the weight of a 74,000-page convoluted tax code and a $1.75 trillion worth of red tape. Every single job creator that I meet, whether it's at a town hall meeting back home in Kansas or here in Washington, D.C., they come here to tell us their story and ask for our help. What they tell me is that we've got to reduce the massive regulatory burden. The overwhelming cost of compliance prevents many small business owners and entrepreneurs from hiring new employees, expanding their facilities, and growing the economy. Second, in addition to the regulatory environment, we've got to say no to spending and yes to pro-job measures. This will help reduce the uncertainty in the marketplace, encourage business investment, and help us become more competitive in the global economy, and most importantly, create jobs. The President's solution is to raise revenues to balance the budget, but the President's tax increase proposals would only cover the deficit for just a few weeks. And does anyone, in fact, I would be pleased to be convinced that if we increase taxes, that the money would be used to pay down the debt. I don't think I'm overly cynical, but my My view of history, my review of the facts suggests that every time there's more revenue, more money in Washington, D.C., more money is spent. History shows that money raised in Washington, D.C. only results in more spending in Washington, D.C. The revenues we need to balance our books are not from increasing taxes. Every nation. Congressional care entitlements, Social Security, and interest on the national debt will consume 100% of the total revenues by 2025. What that means is that money the government spends on national defense, transportation, veterans, health care, and other government programs will have to be borrowed money. That drives us further and further into debt. So, regulations, getting the deficit under control, us on the right path toward a more balanced budget. Third, we must take serious action to address the $48 trillion in unfunded obligations found in Social Security and Medicare. These programs represent promises that were made to Americans, and in my view, there are promises that must be kept. Our family circumstance, my parents, I pretty much know what life is like for people who utilize Social Security and Medicare and the benefits they provide for their lives at that stage in life that we all aspire to. When Social Security was signed into law by President Franklin Roosevelt, average life expectancy was 64 years of age, and the earliest retirement age to collect benefits was 65. Today, Americans live 14 years longer, retire 3 years earlier, and spend 2 decades in retirement. So we've gone from a time in which Social Security was there really for a short period of the remaining life expectancy to a Social Security system that now is a source of income and support for people through a couple of decades of retirement. It means we have to change the way that we support Social Security in order to fit today's demographics. More people retiring, more people living longer, and yet the revenues are therefore insufficient to meet those program needs. When this year's kindergarten class enters college, spending on Social Security and Medicare, plus Medicaid and interest on the debt, will devour all tax revenues. Congress should, can, ought to begin today, should have started a long time ago. We can address these questions concerning the sustainability of very important programs. Lastly, our country's Fiscal House, to get it back in order, Congress should consider and adopt many of the bipartisan recommendations put forth by the President's own Deficit Reduction Commission. The co-chairs of the commission have warned, this is the Simpson-Bowles Commission, the co-chairs warned that if we fail to take swift action, and if we fail to take serious action, the U.S. faces, quote, the most predictable economic crisis in history. In other words, we know it's coming. People who know that something bad is on its way, that an economic crisis is coming, you can predict it. One would expect us to take evasive action to avoid the consequences. And yet, the President and Senate leadership have ignored the recommendations contained in Simpson-Bowles, and we just generally continue to spend borrowed money without regard for those consequences, without regard for what we know is coming. I don't want Americans to experience the day when our creditors decide that we're no longer creditworthy and we have to suffer the same consequences as those countries that ignored their financial crisis. One needs to look no further than places in Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, to see what high levels of national debt will do to a country's economy. Out of control spending is slowing America's economic growth and threatening the prosperity for future generations who will have to pay for our irresponsibility. Thousands and thousands of young Americans will be graduating this month. Typically, graduation day, I guess many of my colleagues will be giving graduation addresses and will be encouraging our graduates to go forth and pursue a great life. We ought to also be telling ourselves that for our college graduates to be able to go forth and pursue that wonderful life, we need to make changes in the way that we do business and get our country's economic conditions and fiscal state to a place in which the American dream can be expected to be pursued and in many cases achieved. I'm fearful that while my parents' generation handed off a country to my generation in which the expectations were high, the belief that we all could live the American dream was felt, I worry that my generation is failing to do the same for the generation that follows mine. If we fail to take action now and leave it for another Congress, another year, another session, another election, if we fail to take the action that we need to do so today because we believe it's just too difficult to do, that we can't afford the political consequences of making what some people describe as very difficult decisions, we clearly will reduce the opportunity of the next generation to experience the country that we know and love, and we will diminish the chances that they can pursue and achieve that American dream. I had somebody in my office recently who travels the globe, and he was indicating to me that every place he goes, people around the globe, around the world know what the phrase American dream means, and they all want to pursue the American dream. But the reminder was that more and more the American dream is pursued outside of America because of the inability for this Congress, the failure of past Congresses and presidents to come together and do the things that are responsible for today, but more importantly, responsible for the well-being of Americans in the future. We were not elected, not one of us was elected to ignore problems. People tell us, each one of us, all the time, some circumstance or condition that's a challenge to them, and I have no doubt but what each one of us in the United States Senate try to figure out, how can we help you? Well, the American people are experiencing a problem. Our country faces a challenge, and we ought to respond in the same way that we respond individually to our own constituents, and we say, how can we help? What can we do? We know the answer to those questions. We just need to have the will, the courage, the desire to work together to see that we address the issues that make certain that America is a place that we're proud to pass on to the next generation, and that no American, because of our fault, is unable to pursue that beautiful American dream. Madam President, I yield the floor.